The Sound of the Heartbeat, a Lifeline original story. They called him the Watchmaker. Dr. Julian Vance didn't just operate, he corrected the biological errors of fate. In the world of pediatric cardiology, he was the final court of appeal. When other surgeons shook their heads and looked at the floor, Julian stepped in. His life was measured in millimeters and seconds.
Julian lived in a world of constant noise, the hum of the hospital ventilation, the incessant chirping of his pager, the ringing of phones, the roar of the city outside his office window. But for 15 years, he had learned to filter it all out. He thought the noise was his fuel. He thought the pressure was what kept his hands steady. He was 44 years old, and he hadn't heard a bird sing in a decade. Not because he was deaf, but because he didn't have a slot in his schedule for nature sounds. Success for Julian sounded like the sharp clear of a defibrillator and the collective exhale of a surgical team when a heart began to beat on its own again.
"You're drifting again, Julian,"
his wife said. They were at a dinner celebrating his promotion to chief of surgery. Sarah was a violinist, a woman who lived for harmony. Julian looked at her, but he didn't really hear her. He was calculating the bypass for a 7-month-old girl scheduled for 6 a.m. the next morning. "I'm here," he lied.
"No,"
Sarah said, her voice tinged with a sadness he chose to ignore.
"You're in room 4. You're always in room 4.
He reached for his wine, but his hand froze. The restaurant noise didn't fade, it shattered. One moment, the world was a symphony of dinner conversation. The next, it was as if someone had plunged his head underwater while a jet engine roared in the distance. He dropped the glass. The shatter was silent. He saw Sarah's mouth move, her face contorting in alarm, but no sound came out. And then, the blackness. Julian woke up in his own hospital. But for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't the one in the white coat. The diagnosis was sudden sensorineural hearing loss, SSHL. Idiopathic, stress-induced, a physical manifestation of a mind that had reached its breaking point. The silence was not peaceful. It was a roar, a terrifying, pressurized void that made his own heartbeat sound like a hammer against a drum inside his skull. He couldn't work. A surgeon who cannot hear the monitor, the anesthesiologist, or the subtle change in a patient's breathing is a liability. For 2 months, Julian stayed in their high-rise apartment. He watched the city through the glass. He saw the ambulances screaming through the streets below, their lights flashing, but they were silent toys in a ghost world. Sarah tried. She wrote notes on a yellow legal pad.
"The doctors say it might be temporary. Rest, Julian. Just rest."
But Julian didn't know how to rest. Without the chaos of the hospital, he felt like a ghost. He felt that if he wasn't the watchmaker, he was nothing. The silence between him and Sarah became a wall. She would play her violin in the other room, and he would watch her bow move, knowing there was beauty in the air that he was now forbidden from experiencing. He felt like a man standing outside a warm house in a blizzard, looking through the window. On a Tuesday in late August, he took a bag and a pad of paper. He wrote 4 words for Sarah.
"I need to listen."
He drove north, away from the sirens, away from the hospital, away from the man he thought he was.
Julian's grandfather had left him a cabin in the North Cascades, a place of cedar, stone, and absolute isolation. Julian hadn't been there in 20 years. To him, it was just an asset on a balance sheet. Now, it was his monastery. He spent the first week in a state of mourning. He would sit on the porch, staring at the trees, his hands, those world-class multi-million-dollar hands, resting uselessly on his knees. They felt twitchy. They missed the scalpel. They missed the life and death stakes. He started with the woodpile. It wasn't about the heat. It was about the impact. When the axe head bit into the Douglas fir, Julian didn't hear the crack, but he felt it. It traveled up the wooden handle, through his palms, into his elbows, and settled in his chest. It was a new language, a bone-deep communication. He began to realize that the world hadn't gone silent. It had just changed its frequency. One afternoon, he walked down to the creek. He sat on a flat rock and closed his eyes. He put his bare hands into the freezing water. For a surgeon, touch is everything, but this was different. He felt the rush of the current against his skin, a constant fluid pressure. He felt the vibration of the water hitting the stones. If he pressed his palms against the mossy earth, he could feel the distant tectonic thrum of the mountain itself. He started to listen with his skin. He began to draw, not anatomical hearts, but the rings of fallen trees, the veins of leaves. He noticed that the pattern of a river delta looked exactly like the bronchial tubes in a lung. The roots of a pine tree looked like the coronary arteries he used to stitch together. The watchmaker was seeing the great design for the first time. He stayed for 3 months. His beard grew thick and gray. His hands, once scrubbed raw with antiseptic, were now stained with sap and dirt. And then something happened that no medical textbook could explain. It started with a storm. The air grew heavy. The birds vanished. Julian stood on the porch, his chest tightening. He felt the lightning before it struck, a prickling of the hair on his arms, a sudden ionization of the atmosphere. When the sky finally broke, the vibration was colossal. The mountains seemed to groan. Julian stood in the rain, soaked to the bone, his mouth open, letting the roar of the universe wash over him. And in the middle of the chaos, he heard it. It wasn't a sound from the outside. It was a tiny, rhythmic thump-thump from within.
He realized he wasn't listening for the storm. He was finally hearing his own heart. Not as a pump he needed to fix, but as a drum he needed to follow. The next morning, the ringing in his ears, that high-pitched scream of stress, was gone. In its place was a soft, fuzzy static, and beneath that static, the very faint, distant sound of a wind chime on the porch.
He wept, not because his hearing was returning, it was still only 10%, but because he realized he didn't need 100% to understand what mattered. He took out his legal pad. He didn't write to Sarah. He drew a picture of a tree, its roots intertwined with a heart. He was ready to go back, but not to room 4.
Julian drove back into the city on a rainy Monday. The skyscrapers didn't look like monuments of success anymore. They looked like giant tuning forks, vibrating with a frantic, anxious energy he no longer shared. His hearing had returned, but only partially. High frequencies were gone.
The world sounded like it was playing on an old, warm vinyl record. To some, it was a disability. To Julian, it was a filter. The noise was gone. Only the signal remained.
He walked into the apartment. Sarah was by the window, her back to him. She didn't hear him enter. He stood there for a long minute, watching the sunlight catch the wood of her violin. He didn't say a word. He walked over and placed his hand on the back of her chair. She turned, her eyes wide. She looked at his hands, the dirt under the nails, the small scars from the axe. She looked at his eyes and realized she wasn't looking at the watchmaker anymore. She was looking at Julian. He picked up a pen and her yellow legal pad. He wrote, "Play for me. I want to feel the music." She played. Julian didn't listen with his ears. He closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against the wooden body of the violin. He felt the vibration of the strings in his skull. He felt the tension, the release, the heartbreak, and the joy. For the first time in their marriage, they were in total, resonant harmony. Julian returned to the hospital, but he never stepped back into room 4. He resigned as chief of surgery. The board was stunned. They offered him money, titles, power. He declined them all. Instead, he used his savings and his influence to create the Resonance Project.
At the very heart of the hospital, where there used to be a sterile concrete courtyard, Julian built a forest. He designed it with the precision of a surgeon. Every stone was placed to create a specific vibration. Every tree was chosen for the way the wind moved through its leaves. There were vibration benches where parents of sick children could sit and feel the deep, calming thrum of the earth. Julian spent his days there. He worked with children who, like him, lived in silence. He taught them how to hear the world through their touch, through their breath, through the heartbeat of the trees. One evening, he saw a young surgeon walking hurriedly toward the OR. The man was pale, his eyes darting, his pager beeping like a panicked bird. Julian stepped into his path. He didn't say anything. He simply placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and pointed toward the garden. "Listen," Julian whispered. It was the only word he had spoken in months. The young surgeon paused. He looked at the trees. He took a breath. And for a second, just 1 second, the noise of the hospital vanished. Here is what Julian would tell you if you asked. He would tell you that we are all surgeons of our own lives, trying to fix things that were never meant to be perfect. That we spend so much time listening to the noise of what we should be, that we forget the sound of who we are. He would tell you that silence is not the absence of sound. It is the beginning of understanding. And he would tell you this: your heart doesn't just pump blood. It keeps time. And if you listen closely enough, past the sirens, past the phones, past the expectations, it will tell you exactly where you need to go. Life is not a straight line. It is a pulse. And as long as it beats, there is still music to be made. Has there ever been a moment when you left something behind, only to realize it was exactly where you belonged? Tell us in the comments. Your story might be the map that guides someone else home. Subscribe to Lifeline, because sometimes you have to lose everything to find your way back to yourself.